He was trained to be feared, and the man standing in front of him couldn't even see him. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and cold metal, the kind of place where second chances rarely walked out on their own. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a pale, unforgiving glow across concrete floors worn smooth by years of hesitation and regret. Somewhere in the distance, a gate clanged shut, the echo lingering longer than it should, like a warning no one dared to repeat out loud. Daniel Hayes stood just inside the doorway, shoulders squared out of habit rather than confidence, his unseeing eyes fixed forward as if the darkness in front of him might one day answer back. His hand rested lightly on a white cane, fingers steady, controlled, the grip of a man who had learned to measure the world in inches instead of miles. He had once measured it in miles. In missions. In the distance between life and loss. Now it was steps. Just steps. 10 feet ahead, behind reinforced bars, something shifted. Not loud. Not aggressive. Just enough to be felt. A presence more than a sound. The dog didn't bark. Didn't growl. He simply watched. Rex. Retired K9. Classified as high risk. The label hung heavier than the steel gate that kept him contained. His silhouette was still, almost carved from shadow, broad shoulders rising and falling with slow, controlled breaths. Every movement was deliberate. Every pause earned. There had been a time when commands guided him, when purpose gave his instincts direction. But purpose had a way of disappearing when people stopped believing in what you could be and only remembered what you had done. A man behind Daniel cleared his throat quietly, voice low, careful not to travel too far. "You don't have to go in there," he said. "We can find another dog." Daniel didn't respond. The words hovered in the air, unanswered, unnecessary. His jaw tightened slightly, not in defiance, but in recognition. He had heard that tone before. The same tone they used when they thought something was already broken beyond repair. He took one step forward. The cane tapped softly against the floor, a small sound swallowed by the room. Another step. Then another. Each one measured, intentional, as if the distance between him and the unknown was something sacred. Inside the enclosure, Rex shifted again. Not retreating. Not advancing. Just adjusting, as though aligning himself with something only he could sense. His ears angled forward, catching the rhythm of footsteps, the subtle change in breathing, the quiet determination carried in the man's approach. No fear. That was the first thing Rex noticed. Not courage. Not yet. Just the absence of fear. It was unfamiliar. Daniel stopped a few feet from the gate. Close enough to feel the faint warmth radiating from the other side. Close enough to know he wasn't alone. His hand lifted slightly, hovering in the space between certainty and risk. "I know you're there," he said softly, voice calm, steady, carrying something deeper than sound. Not a command. Not a plea. Just truth. The room seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere behind them, someone shifted their weight, ready to intervene, ready to call it off. But nothing happened. Not yet. Because on the other side of that barrier, a dog once taught to react, chose to wait. The handler's hand hovered near the control latch, not touching it yet, just close enough to remind everyone in the room that control still existed, that there was still a way to stop what might unfold. But Daniel did not move back and Rex did not move away, and in that quiet standoff something unfamiliar began to settle into the space between them, something that did not belong to training or commands or fear, something slower, older. Like recognition finding its way through layers of memory. Neither of them could fully explain, and Daniel exhaled softly, the sound almost lost beneath the hum of the lights as his fingers extended a fraction further into the empty air, searching not for shape but for presence, for proof that something living stood before him, while inside the enclosure Rex lowered his head just slightly, not in submission but in focus, his amber eyes fixed on the man whose gaze could not return the look. And yet somehow felt seen anyway, and it stirred a memory that had no words, only sensation, the echo of long nights under open skies. Where silence meant survival and trust was something you learned without being told, and Daniel took another step forward until the tip of his cane brushed gently against the base of the gate, a soft tap that seemed louder than it should have been, and he stopped there, steady, listening, the way he had learned to listen after the world went dark, listening not just with his ears but with something deeper. Something that measured intent instead of movement, and behind him the handler spoke. Again, quieter now, almost uncertain. "Sir, he has not responded well to new people." But Daniel's head tilted just slightly as if catching a different frequency entirely, and his voice came low and calm. "He is responding." And for a moment no one argued, because the truth was in the stillness, in the absence of chaos where chaos had once been expected, and Rex took a single step closer to the gate, slow, controlled, each paw placed with care as if testing the ground beneath him, and when he reached the barrier he did not press against it, did not challenge it, he simply stood there, close enough that Daniel could feel the faint warmth of breath through the metal, and Daniel's hand hovered inches away, trembling just slightly now, not from fear but from the weight of the moment, the kind that does not announce itself but arrives all at once, and he spoke again, softer this time. "You do not have to prove anything." The words simple, almost ordinary, but they carried something that training commands never had, and Rex's ears shifted, catching the tone more than the meaning, because tone was where truth lived, and something in that voice did not ask, did not demand, did not expect, it simply allowed, and that was new, that was different, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, Rex leaned forward until the space between them narrowed to nothing but air and hesitation, and the room seemed to lean with him, every breath held. Every movement paused, waiting to see whether instinct would return or something else would take its place, and Daniel did not pull back, did not flinch, he simply stood there with his hand extended into darkness, trusting something he could not see, and for the first time in a long time, Rex did not feel like something to be controlled, he felt like something being understood. For a long second nothing moved, not the handler, not the air, not even the quiet hum of the lights seemed to exist anymore, and then it happened in a way so small it almost escaped notice. Rex inhaled, slow and deep, drawing in the scent that hung around Daniel like a story written in fragments, the faint trace of worn leather, dust, old fabric, and beneath it something harder to name. Something that carried the echo of heat and distance, and long roads that did not end the way they were supposed to, and it pulled at something buried deep inside him, something older than commands and louder than fear, and Daniel felt it without seeing it, the shift in presence, the change in weight on the other side of the gate, and his fingers steadied, no longer searching but waiting, offering rather than reaching, and Rex stepped closer until his nose hovered just inches from the man's hand, close enough to feel warmth, close enough to choose. And for a brief moment time stretched thin, balancing on the edge of instinct, the kind that had once defined him, the kind that had been written into him by years of training and expectation. But there was no command now, no handler guiding the moment, only silence and the quiet pulse of something unfamiliar, and Daniel spoke again, almost a whisper. "It is all right." Not to control, not to correct, but to allow, and Rex lowered his head just enough for the first contact to happen, a soft brush of fur against skin, so light it could have been mistaken for nothing at all, but Daniel felt it, every detail of it, the texture, the warmth, the living proof that something had crossed the distance between them, and his breath caught for just a second before settling into something steadier, something grounded, and he did not pull away, did not rush the moment, he simply let his hand rest there, open, patient, and Rex did not retreat, he stayed. Nose pressed gently against the offered hand as if confirming what his instincts were. Beginning to understand that this man carried no threat, no demand, no hidden edge, only something quiet and steady, something that did not need sight to recognize truth, and behind them the handler shifted again, the tension in the room loosening by degrees as disbelief began to replace expectation, because this was not how it usually went, not with Rex, not with anyone new, and yet here they were, suspended in a moment that did not follow the old rules, and Daniel let his fingers move just slightly, barely enough to trace the outline of the dog's muzzle, careful, respectful, learning through touch what others had judged from a distance, and Rex allowed it, still as stone, not because he was commanded to be but because he chose to be, and that choice changed something, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that settled deep and stayed, and Daniel's voice came again, softer now, almost reflective. "You remember too, do you not?" And there was no answer in words, but Rex's stillness held something that felt close enough, and in that quiet space between a man who could not see and a dog who had been taught not to trust, something began to rebuild itself piece by piece, not from training or expectation, but from the simple act of not turning away. The contact did not break, and that was the first sign that something deeper than instinct was unfolding, because Rex had always measured the world in reactions, in signals that came fast and clear. But this was different, this was slow, almost quiet enough to miss, and yet it held him there more firmly than any command ever had, and Daniel's hand remained where it was, resting gently against the dog's muzzle, not claiming, not guiding, just present, and for a moment the years between them seemed to collapse into something simple, something almost forgotten, the idea that trust did not have to be forced into existence, it could be allowed to grow, and Daniel drew in a slow breath, the kind that steadies a man from the inside out, and he spoke again, softer now. "You are not what they say you are." And the words settled into the space between them like something meant to stay, and Rex did not move away, instead he shifted his weight forward just slightly, enough for his shoulder to brush the gate, a quiet sound of metal meeting fur, and Daniel felt it, that subtle change, and his fingers moved with more certainty now, tracing along the line of the dog's face, the curve of bone beneath fur, learning the shape of something that had once been defined by fear in the eyes of others, and behind them the handler let out a breath he had not realized he was holding, the tension in his posture easing as he lowered his hand from the latch. Not fully, but enough to acknowledge that whatever was happening did not belong to interruption, and the room began to breathe again, quietly, cautiously, as if afraid to disturb the fragile balance that had formed, and Rex closed his eyes for the briefest moment, not in submission but in stillness, in the rare permission to exist without expectation, and it stirred something distant, a memory not of commands but of presence, of standing beside someone who did not need to prove control, only to remain, and Daniel's voice carried that same steadiness. "It has been a long time since anyone just stood with you, has it not?" And though no answer came in words, Rex's body softened by a fraction, the rigid lines of readiness easing into something less guarded, something closer to rest, and Daniel felt it through his fingertips, the subtle shift that spoke louder than sound, and he allowed his hand to lower just slightly, giving space rather than taking it, and Rex followed that movement, not out of obedience but choice, stepping closer until the barrier between them felt thinner than it truly was, and for the first time since entering the room, Daniel smiled, not wide, not for show, but a small, quiet expression that came from somewhere deeper than sight, and the handler glanced at the others nearby, uncertainty giving way to something like understanding, because what they were witnessing was not training, not correction, not rehabilitation in the way they had known it, it was something slower, something that could not be rushed or measured, a connection built not on control but on recognition, and Daniel tilted his head slightly as if listening again, not to sound but to presence, and he said, almost to himself, "You are still here." And Rex remained where he was, steady, present, choosing not to turn away, and in that choice, something long buried began to rise, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet strength of something that had never truly been lost, only waiting for the right moment to be seen again, even if the man standing before him could not see at all. Time did not rush forward, it unfolded, slow and deliberate, like something long held back finally allowed to breathe, and Daniel kept his hand where it rested, no longer searching, no longer uncertain, simply present in a way that did not demand anything in return, and Rex stayed with him, not because he had to, not because anyone told him to, but because something in that stillness felt safer than stepping away. And the room around them began to shift in quiet ways, the tension that once filled it now thinning into something softer, something almost unfamiliar to the people watching, because they had seen Rex react before, they had seen him pull away, resist, shut down, but they had never seen him remain like this, grounded, attentive, choosing connection over distance, and Daniel tilted his head slightly as if listening to something only he could hear, though it was not sound that guided him now, it was presence. The subtle language of breath and movement, and the quiet honesty. That cannot be hidden, and he spoke again, low and steady. I think you have been waiting. And Rex's ears shifted at the tone, not the words, because tone carried truth, and there was no fear in it, no hesitation, only recognition, and it settled into him in a way that training never had, and Daniel slowly lowered himself down, careful, controlled, until one knee met the cold concrete floor, bringing him closer not just in distance but in understanding, and his hand followed the motion, gliding gently along the side of Rex's face until it rested just beneath the jaw, and Rex allowed it, not stiff, not guarded, but steady, his breathing deep and even as if matching the rhythm of the man before him, and for a moment the barrier between them felt like nothing more than a line drawn by habit, not truth, and the handler glanced toward the others again. Uncertainty now replaced with something quieter, something that asked a different question entirely, not whether this should stop, but whether it should be allowed to continue, and no one spoke, because there was nothing to correct, nothing to interrupt, only something to witness, and Daniel exhaled slowly, the sound carrying a weight that had been with him for years, a weight shaped by darkness and memory and the long silence that follows both. And he said, almost to himself, "They said I needed a guide," and his fingers curled slightly into the fur beneath his hand, grounding himself in something real, something present. "But I think you needed someone who would stay." And Rex shifted again, closer this time, until his shoulder rested lightly against the gate, and the faint pressure traveled through metal into Daniel's hand, a quiet answer that did not need words, and Daniel's expression softened, not in relief, not yet, but in recognition of something beginning, something fragile and strong at the same time, and he let his hand rest there without moving, without asking for more, because he understood now that this was not about control or correction, it was about choice, and Rex had made his, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the simplest way possible, by not turning away, and in that choice something changed, something that could not be undone, and the room, once filled with expectation, now held something else entirely, something quieter, deeper, like the first moment after a storm when the air feels different and you know, without needing to be told, that something has passed and something new has begun. The moment did not end, it deepened, settling into something neither man nor dog had planned but both seemed to understand without needing to name it, and Daniel remained kneeling on the cold concrete, his hand still resting beneath Rex's jaw, feeling the steady rise and fall of breath that no longer carried tension but something closer to calm, and for the first time in a long while, the silence around him did not feel empty, it felt full, as if the space itself had shifted to make room for something real, and Rex stayed where he was, his body no longer held tight by instinct or expectation, but balanced in a quiet awareness that allowed him to remain without retreat, and that choice echoed deeper than any command he had ever followed, because this time it came from him, and Daniel seemed to sense it, not through sight but through the subtle language he had learned to trust, the small shifts in weight, the rhythm of breath, the presence that could not be faked, and he spoke again, his voice carrying a quiet certainty now. "You are not alone anymore." And the words were not dramatic, not loud, but they landed with a weight that lingered, as if they belonged not just to this moment but to everything that had come before it, and Rex's ears softened, the rigid edge of alertness easing into something gentler, something that had been buried beneath layers of expectation and misunderstanding, and Daniel slowly shifted his position, rising just enough to sit back on his heel, careful not to break the connection, careful not to rush what had taken so long to begin, and his hand moved slightly, resting now along the side of Rex's neck, fingers threading gently through thick fur, not gripping, not guiding, just staying, and Rex leaned into that contact by the smallest degree, a movement so subtle it might have gone unnoticed by anyone not paying close attention, but Daniel felt it immediately, and his breath caught for a brief second before settling again. Because that small movement meant something more than any visible action, it meant trust was no longer one-sided, it was being returned, and behind them the handler stepped back half a pace, not out of fear but respect, recognizing that this moment did not belong to protocol or correction, it belonged to something that could not be taught in training manuals, something that required time and patience, and the willingness to see beyond what had been written in reports, and Daniel let out a quiet breath. Almost like a release, as if something he had been carrying for years had just shifted slightly out of place, and he said softly, "I cannot see you," pausing just long enough for the truth of it to settle. "But I know you are here." And Rex did not move away, did not break the contact, he simply stayed, grounded in the presence of a man who did not judge him by what he appeared to be, but by what he chose in this moment, and that choice, simple as it was, began to rewrite something deeper than memory, something closer to identity, and the room remained quiet, not tense, not uncertain, but still in a way that felt almost sacred, because everyone there understood, even if they could not explain it, that something rare was happening, something that could not be forced or replicated, a connection forming not from control but from understanding, and Daniel allowed his hand to rest there, steady and sure, no longer searching, no longer questioning, just present, and Rex remained beside him, not as something to be feared, not as something to be fixed, but as something that had finally been seen for what it truly was, even by a man who could not see at all. The stillness did not break when Daniel slowly shifted his weight and rose to his feet. It followed him, lingering like something that refused to be left behind, and Rex adjusted with him, stepping forward in quiet alignment as if the space between them had already been erased, even though the metal gate still stood where it always had, and Daniel turned his head slightly toward the handler, not fully, just enough to acknowledge the presence behind him, and his voice carried a calm certainty that had not been there before. "Can you open it?" And the question was simple, but the room reacted as if it carried far more weight than the words themselves, because this was the moment where everything could shift again, where uncertainty might return, where instinct could take back what had just been given, and the handler hesitated, not out of doubt in Daniel, but out of habit. Out of the long list of reasons he had been given not to trust what stood on the other side of that barrier, and yet what he had just witnessed did not fit into those reasons anymore, it stood apart from them, quiet and undeniable, and he reached for the latch, slower this time, not with control but with caution, as if opening it too quickly might disturb something fragile, and the soft click of metal releasing echoed louder than expected, and Daniel did not move forward immediately. He waited, giving the moment space to unfold on its own terms, and Rex stood just inside the threshold, no tension in his stance, no sign of retreat, only a steady presence that held its ground without challenge, and when the gate finally opened, it did not swing wide, it moved just enough to create an opening. A narrow space between what had been and what could be, and Daniel took a single step forward, crossing that line without hesitation, his hand lowering once more, not reaching blindly but offering the same quiet invitation as before, and Rex stepped out to meet him, not rushing, not bounding, just walking forward with a calm that seemed to carry intention, and when he reached Daniel, he did something no one in the room had expected, something that could not be taught or commanded. He turned slightly and pressed his body gently against the man's leg, a steady, grounding contact that spoke more clearly than any trained behavior, and Daniel felt it immediately, the weight, the warmth, the presence that anchored him in a way that nothing else had since the day he lost his sight, and his breath caught, not in fear, but in something closer to recognition, as if this was not the beginning of something new but the return of something that had been missing, and his hand came to rest along Rex's back, fingers settling into the thick fur with a familiarity that did not need to be explained, and the room fell silent again, not in tension but in quiet understanding, because what they were witnessing was not correction, not rehabilitation, it was something else entirely, something that did not follow the rules they had been taught, and Daniel spoke softly, almost to himself. "There you are." And Rex remained beside him, unmoving, steady, choosing to stay in that place where trust had finally found a way to exist, and in that simple act, everything that had once defined him began to fade into something less important than the choice he was making now, and Daniel stood there, no longer alone, no longer searching, with a presence beside him that did not need to be seen to be known, and for the first time in a long time, the space ahead of him did not feel uncertain, it felt possible. The room did not return to what it had been, it could not, because something had already shifted too deeply to be undone, and as Daniel stood with Rex pressed quietly against his side, The world beyond that small enclosure began to feel different, not because anything visible had changed, but because something inside him had, and Rex sensed it in the way he always sensed things that mattered, through the subtle change in breath. The steadiness in posture, the absence of hesitation that had once lived in every movement, and without being told, without needing a command, he adjusted his position, aligning himself just slightly ahead of Daniel's step, not pulling, not guiding yet, but anticipating, as if some part of him remembered what it meant to move with purpose beside someone who trusted him, and Daniel felt that shift instantly, his hand resting along Rex's back, grounding himself in the quiet certainty that had formed between them, and he took a step forward, slow, measured. And Rex moved with him, matching the pace, not rushing, not resisting, simply staying in rhythm, and the floor beneath them carried the faint echo of movement, soft and steady, like a beginning that did not need to announce itself loudly to be real, and the handler watched from behind, no longer tense, no longer ready to intervene, but still, almost reverent, as if witnessing something that could not be recreated once lost. And Daniel paused after a few steps, his head tilting slightly as if listening again not to the room, but to the presence beside him, and he spoke quietly. "You are already doing it." And Rex's ears shifted forward, catching the tone, the affirmation that carried no demand, only acknowledgement, and something inside him responded, something that had been dormant, waiting, and he took a slightly more deliberate step forward, positioning himself with quiet precision, his body forming a natural line beside Daniel, and the man followed without question, without fear. Trusting something he could not see but now fully believed in, and the space opened ahead of them, no longer confined by the narrow frame of the enclosure, but stretching into a hallway that carried faint sounds of distant movement, voices, doors opening and closing somewhere far away, and Daniel did not hesitate. He moved into that space with Rex beside him, each step building on the last, each movement reinforcing what had already been chosen between them, and Rex remained steady, his focus no longer scattered, no longer uncertain, but centered entirely on the man at his side, reading the subtle cues of motion and balance, adjusting with quiet precision, not because he had been told to, but because he understood, and that understanding changed everything, and Daniel's grip on his cane loosened slightly, not because he no longer needed it, but because he was no longer relying on it alone, and Rex felt that shift, the transfer of trust, and he responded in the only way that mattered, by staying exactly where he needed to be, and as they moved farther down the hallway, the light changed. Warmer now, softer, reflecting off surfaces Daniel could not see but could feel in the way the air moved around him, and he allowed himself a small breath, something close to relief, something he had not felt in a long time, and he said softly, almost with wonder, "It feels different." And Rex did not need to understand the words to understand the meaning, because he felt it too, the difference in the space, the difference in the man, the difference in himself, and behind them the handler remained where he was, watching as the distance between what had been and what was becoming grew wider with each step, and he did not call them back, did not interrupt, because he knew now that whatever was happening could not be guided by rules or corrected by intervention, it had to unfold on its own, and Daniel continued forward, his steps growing more certain, more fluid, as if something within him had remembered how to move without fear, and Rex stayed with him, not as a tool, not as a solution, but as a partner, steady and present, and the world ahead, once defined by darkness, now held something else entirely, something quiet and real, something that did not need to be seen to be believed, and for the first time since everything had changed, Daniel did not feel like he was walking into the unknown, he felt like he was finally walking towards something that had been waiting for him all along. The hallway seemed longer now, not because the distance had changed, but because each step carried meaning that had not existed before, and Daniel moved forward with a steadiness that came not from certainty of the path ahead, but from trust in what walked beside him, and Rex remained aligned at his side, his movement no longer tentative, no longer testing, but sure in a way that could only come from choosing to be present fully. And the rhythm between them settled into something natural, something unspoken yet deeply understood, like two stories finally finding the same page after years of being written apart, and the air felt warmer as they reached the end of the corridor, where a door stood slightly open, letting in a soft current that carried the faint scent of grass and sunlight, and Daniel paused there, just for a moment, his head tilting slightly as if he could feel the difference in the space beyond. And his hand rested lightly against Rex's back, grounding himself in the connection that had formed, and he whispered quietly, "This is where it begins." Not as a declaration, but as a realization, and Rex shifted his weight forward, sensing the change, the openness beyond the doorway, and he stepped just a fraction ahead, guiding without pressure, offering direction without demand, and Daniel followed, trusting the subtle movement, stepping into the light he could not see but could feel in the warmth that brushed against his face, and outside the building the world stretched wide, the distant sound of wind moving through trees, the faint hum of a road somewhere beyond, the soft uneven texture of ground beneath his boots, and for a brief moment he stood still, taking it in, not with sight, but with something deeper, something that had been silent for too long, and Rex remained close, his body angled slightly to maintain contact, not crowding, not pulling, simply there. And Daniel let out a breath that felt different from all the others, lighter, freer, as if something inside him had finally loosened its grip, and he spoke again, his voice carrying a quiet strength. "I thought I lost everything that day." And his fingers curled slightly into Rex's fur, a small gesture that held more meaning than words could carry. "But maybe I only lost what I thought I needed." And Rex stood still beside him, his presence steady and unwavering, not reacting to the words but to the feeling behind them, and Daniel took another step forward, then another, moving across the open ground with a confidence that had not been there before, not because the world had become easier, but because he no longer faced it alone, and Rex adjusted with each step, reading the terrain, sensing the shifts in balance, guiding in quiet ways that did not draw attention but made all the difference, and from the doorway behind them the handler watched, arms at his sides, no longer uncertain, no longer cautious, but still, almost humbled by what he had witnessed, because the reports had been wrong, not in their facts, but in their conclusions. They had measured behavior but missed truth, and now that truth stood before him, moving steadily into a future that had once seemed impossible, and Daniel slowed after a few yards, his steps coming to a gentle stop as he turned his head slightly toward Rex, not seeing him, but knowing exactly where he was, and he said softly, "You did not leave." And there was no need for Rex to respond in any way but the one that mattered. He stayed, right there, solid and present, and Daniel smiled, a small, quiet expression that did not need to be seen to be understood, and he took one more step forward, then another, moving with purpose now, not searching, not wandering, but walking with direction shaped by trust, and Rex walked beside him, not as something feared, not as something defined by the past, but as something chosen. Something that had found its place not through force, but through a moment of stillness that changed everything, and the world ahead remained unseen, but it no longer felt empty, it felt full, filled with possibility, filled with the quiet certainty that even without sight, a man could find his way again, not by looking for light, but by walking with something that refused to let him face the dark alone. And as they moved farther into the open, their steps blending into one steady rhythm, it became clear in the simplest way possible that neither of them had been waiting to be saved, they had been waiting to be understood, and in that understanding, they had found something greater than either could have reached alone. Something that did not need to be named to be real, something that would carry them forward long after this moment faded, and Daniel did not look back, because for the first time in a long time, he did not need to.